He thought rejecting her would be easy, just another quiet woman who didn't belong in a place like this. But Daniel Brooks had no idea that in less than an hour, everything he believed about power, status, and control would collapse right in front of him. Because the moment Emily Carter stepped through the glass doors of Laurent Dining, the entire room shifted in ways no one could yet explain. The soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors, the faint clink of crystal glasses, the low hum of wealthy conversations. It was a space designed to separate those who belonged from those who didn't. And Daniel had built his reputation on knowing the difference, standing tall in his tailored navy suit, scanning every guest like a gatekeeper of privilege, until his eyes landed on her. Simple gray cardigan, modest shoes, no designer label in sight. And in that single glance, he made his decision. Because people like her didn't walk into places like this without a reason, and it was rarely a good one. Emily moved calmly toward the host's stand, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable, as if she didn't notice the subtle glances, the barely hidden smirks from nearby tables, or the way Daniel's polite smile tightened just slightly as she approached. "Reservation?" he asked, his tone smooth but distant. Already preparing to dismiss her, Emily met his gaze, steady, quiet. "No reservation. Just a table for one," she said softly, and for a brief second, something flickered in Daniel's eyes, not doubt, but calculation, because denying her outright would be too obvious, too crude. So instead he chose something sharper, something more refined. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," he replied, gesturing subtly to the crowded dining room. Though a careful observer might have noticed the empty table near the window, untouched, waiting, Emily glanced at it, just for a second, then back at him. Her eyes calm, almost too calm. "I see," she said, no argument, no frustration, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because most people pushed back, they pleaded, they tried to prove they belonged, but she didn't. She simply stood there, as if she already knew how this would end. Daniel felt the weight of nearby eyes, guests watching, judging not her, but him, and so he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to sound polite, just enough to make it sting. "Perhaps somewhere more casual would suit you better," he added, and a quiet ripple of amusement passed through the room. But Emily didn't react, not the way he expected. Instead, she gave a small nod, almost as if she'd just confirmed something to herself, then slowly reached into her bag. Her movements unhurried, deliberate, the room holding its breath without knowing why. And in that silence, something shifted, something Daniel couldn't quite name, because for the first time since she walked in, it felt like he wasn't the one in control anymore. Emily's fingers brushed against her phone, but she did not rush, she did not fumble. Every movement carried a quiet precision that did not belong to someone who had just been dismissed, and that subtle difference began to ripple through the room in ways no one could explain, because while Daniel Brooks turned slightly to greet another well-dressed couple approaching the entrance, his attention kept drifting back to her, to the way she stood there without embarrassment, without urgency, as if time itself had slowed around her, the chandeliers above casting a soft glow across her face, revealing not discomfort, but something far more unsettling, certainty. And in a place where status was everything, certainty without proof was dangerous. "Is there anything else I can assist you with?" Daniel asked, his voice returning to that polished tone, hoping to close the moment, to move on, to restore the invisible hierarchy that kept everything in order. But Emily simply looked at him, her eyes steady, almost reflective, as if she were observing him rather than the other way around. "No," she said quietly. "You have already done enough." And there was no accusation in her voice, no anger, which somehow made it land heavier than any confrontation could have, because Daniel could not categorize it, could not file it under complaint or conflict, and that left him with something he rarely felt, uncertainty. Behind them, a server paused mid-step. A couple at the bar lowered their voices, and even the faint clinking of silverware seemed to soften, as if the room itself was listening. Emily glanced down at her phone for just a moment, her thumb tapping the screen once, a single message sent, no urgency, no explanation. Then she slipped it back into her bag with the same calm composure. And that was when the first shift happened, subtle, almost invisible. The front doors opened again, not with the usual casual push of arriving guests, but with a deliberate motion, smooth, controlled, and a man in a dark tailored suit stepped inside, his posture straight, his expression focused, not scanning the room like a customer, but searching, and when his eyes landed on Emily, everything about him changed. His pace quickened, his demeanor sharpened. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise, not loud, but unmistakable. And just like that, the invisible balance of the room tilted. Daniel felt it before he understood it. The way conversations faltered, the way heads turned, the way the staff nearest the entrance straightened instinctively, reacting to something they could not yet name. Emily turned slightly toward the man, offering a small nod, acknowledging him as if this was expected, as if this was always going to happen, and Daniel's mind raced, searching for context, for meaning, for anything that could restore his sense of control, because in a place where he prided himself on knowing exactly who mattered, he had just been introduced to a reality he did not recognize, and the worst part was not that he might have made a mistake. It was that he was beginning to realize it was not a small one. Daniel's throat tightened almost imperceptibly as the man in the tailored suit stopped just a few feet from Emily, his posture shifting from urgency to respect in a way that did not match how anyone in this room treated a casually dressed guest. And that single detail began to unravel everything Daniel thought he understood about status, because respect like that was never given without reason. "We have been trying to reach you," the man said, his voice controlled but carrying weight, the kind that came from authority, not volume. Emily gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I wanted to see things for myself," she replied, her tone calm, measured, as if this entire situation had been intentional. And that was when Daniel felt it. Not fear, not yet, but the first real crack in his confidence, because nothing about this interaction fit the narrative he had constructed just moments ago. Behind him, one of the junior hosts shifted awkwardly, glancing between Daniel and the newcomer, sensing the change but not understanding it. While at the bar, a woman slowly set down her glass, eyes narrowing with curiosity. The room was no longer just observing. It was waiting. The man in the suit turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the space before settling briefly on Daniel, not with hostility, but with recognition. The kind that said he knew exactly who was responsible for what had just happened. "Is there an issue here?" he asked, and the question was simple, but the silence that followed made it feel anything but. Daniel opened his mouth, prepared to deliver the same polished explanation he had used countless times before, but the words did not come as easily now, because suddenly, they sounded different in his own head, thinner, less certain. "There was a misunderstanding about availability," he said finally, each word carefully chosen, as if precision could restore control. Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again, not accusing, not confrontational, just steady, and that steadiness forced him to continue. "We are fully committed this evening," he added, though even as he spoke, his gaze flickered for a fraction of a second toward the empty table by the window, and that was enough. The man in the suit followed the glance, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, not anger, but acknowledgement, as if a quiet confirmation had just been made. The air grew heavier, conversations around them dissolving into hushed whispers. And then the man spoke again, softer this time, but sharper. "That table is reserved," he said, his voice even, "for her." And the words did not echo. They settled, deep and undeniable, like a truth that had always been there waiting to be noticed. Daniel felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing through possibilities, reservations, names, ownership structures, anything that could explain what he was hearing, because there was only one category of person who had tables permanently reserved in a place like this, and they did not walk in unnoticed, they did not wait at the host's stand, and they certainly were not turned away. Emily did not move, did not step forward, did not claim the space. She simply stood there, allowing the realization to unfold on its own. And that was what made it worse, because no one had to announce anything. No one had to raise their voice. The truth was revealing itself piece by piece, and Daniel was standing at the center of it, watching his certainty dissolve into something far more dangerous. Understanding the words did not need to be repeated, because everyone in the room had already heard them clearly. That table was reserved for her, and in a place like Lauron dining. Reservations like that were not made lightly. They were tied to names that carried weight, names that shaped decisions long before anyone stepped through the door, and Daniel felt that truth settle over him like a quiet pressure, tightening with every passing second, his eyes flicking once more toward the window table, pristine, untouched, waiting exactly as it had been all evening, not forgotten, not overlooked, but held, deliberately, and suddenly the absence of a name on his list no longer felt like proof of her insignificance. It felt like evidence of his own oversight, a detail missed in a system he believed he controlled perfectly. The man in the suit stepped slightly to the side, giving Emily space, not guiding her, not instructing her, but acknowledging her presence in a way that redefined the entire dynamic. And it was in that subtle shift that the rest of the staff began to understand. Posture straightening, expressions tightening, the quiet choreography of a room adjusting to a new reality. Daniel swallowed, the practiced confidence he wore so effortlessly now feeling fragile, almost misplaced. If there has been an error, I can correct it immediately, he said, his voice still controlled, but lacking the edge it carried before. Because this was no longer about managing a guest. This was about correcting a mistake that should never have happened. Emily looked at him, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a calm clarity that made his words feel smaller than they were. There was no error, she said softly, and for a moment, that was all. Just a simple statement that carried more weight than any accusation, because it meant everything. That had happened was exactly as it appeared, intentional, visible, undeniable. The room held its breath again, the kind of silence that follows a realization too large to ignore. Daniel felt heat rise beneath his collar, not from embarrassment alone, but from the sudden awareness that every glance, every whisper, every subtle shift in the room was now directed at him, not as the authority, but as the example. The man who had misjudged, misread, and now stood exposed in the very environment he once controlled. Ms. Carter, the man in the suit added gently, "Would you like your usual table prepared?" And the phrasing alone changed everything. Not offered, not suggested, but prepared, as if her presence here was not an exception, but a routine, a certainty. Emily's gaze moved briefly toward the window, then back to Daniel, and in that small movement, the entire situation reached its peak. Because she was not reclaiming something denied, she was simply deciding whether to accept what had always been hers, and Daniel understood then, fully, completely, that this was not a misunderstanding, not a coincidence, but a moment that revealed something far more permanent than a single mistake. It revealed how quickly respect could disappear when it was built on assumptions, and how impossible it was to recover once that truth had been seen. And as Emily finally took a step forward, the room did not just watch. It remembered Emily's step toward the window table was unhurried, deliberate, each movement echoing softly against the marble floor as if the space itself was adjusting to her presence. And with every inch she advanced, the invisible line that once separated her from belonging dissolved completely. Staff members who had barely noticed her moments ago now shifted instinctively, one server straightening his jacket, another quietly stepping aside, their attention no longer guided by appearance but by recognition. And Daniel stood still, caught in the space between what he believed and what was now undeniably real, his mind replaying every word he had said, every glance he had cast, each one now carrying a weight he could not undo. "Please allow us to prepare everything properly," he said, stepping forward slightly. His tone softened, stripped of its earlier sharpness. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they arrived too late, because this was no longer about service, it was about consequence. Emily paused just briefly, not to acknowledge his offer, but as if measuring something deeper, something beyond the moment itself, her gaze drifting across the room, taking in the polished surfaces, the attentive staff, the guests who now avoided direct eye contact, and in that quiet observation, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath again, waiting not for her reaction, but for what she would reveal next. The man in the suit remained a step behind her, silent, present, a constant reminder that this was not a coincidence, but a reality long established before tonight. And as Emily reached the table, her hand resting lightly against the back of the chair, she did not sit immediately. Instead, she turned slightly, just enough for her voice to carry without rising. "How long have you worked here, Daniel?" she asked, and the question, simple as it was, cut deeper than anything before it, because it was not asked out of curiosity, but clarity. Daniel hesitated, the answer forming slower than it should have. 5 years, he replied. And in that moment, 5 years of certainty, of decisions made with confidence, of judgments passed without hesitation, all stood exposed under a single question. Emily nodded once, absorbing the answer. "Then you should know," she said, her voice steady, calm. This place was never built on appearances, and the words settled into the room like a quiet verdict, not loud, not harsh, but impossible to ignore. Because they did not accuse, they revealed. Daniel felt the weight of them settle over him, heavier than any reprimand could have been, because they did not target him directly. They simply illuminated what he had already done, and there was no defense against that, no explanation that could restore what had been lost. The room remained silent, not out of shock now, but understanding, a shared awareness that something had shifted beyond a single interaction, beyond a single mistake, and as Emily finally took her seat, the soft scrape of the chair against the floor echoing gently, it marked not just the end of a moment, but the beginning of something Daniel could not yet fully grasp, because respect, once broken in silence, does not return with words. And that night, everyone in that room learned exactly what it costs to assume the moment Emily settled into the chair. The entire atmosphere of Lauren dining shifted from tension to precision, as if an invisible switch had been flipped, and everyone suddenly remembered exactly how things were supposed to be. A senior server appeared almost instantly, posture impeccable, voice lowered with respect. "Welcome back, Miss Carter," he said, not as a performance, but as recognition, the kind that came from history, not assumption, and that single phrase echoed louder than any confrontation, because it confirmed what no one had dared to say out loud. This was not her first time here. She did not stumble into this space. She belonged to it in ways deeper than anyone had realized. Daniel remained near the host's stand, unmoving, watching as the service unfolded around her with a level of attention he himself had only ever extended to the most important guests. And now he understood why. The details he had overlooked, the absence of her name on the visible list, the untouched table, the quiet readiness of the staff who seemed to shift into place the moment she sat down. All of it formed a pattern he should have recognized, but did not, and that failure now stood in plain sight, impossible to ignore. Emily rested her hands lightly on the table, her expression calm, unchanged, as if nothing about the evening had disrupted her, and perhaps it had not. Perhaps this had never been about her at all, but about what others revealed when given the chance. The man in the tailored suit stepped closer, leaning slightly as he spoke in a low, respectful tone. "The board has been waiting for your review on the expansion proposal," he said, careful, measured, and though the words were quiet, they carried far enough, just enough for those closest to hear, and that was all it took. Because the phrase alone redefined everything. Board, expansion, review. These were not the concerns of a guest. They were the language of ownership, of authority that operated beyond the dining room. And Daniel felt the realization land fully, not as a sudden shock, but as a complete understanding that settled into place piece by piece. She was not just someone important. She was someone integral, someone whose presence shaped decisions long before they reached the floor. A woman who did not need to announce herself because the structure of the place already carried her influence. And in that moment, Daniel saw his role clearly for the first time, not as the gatekeeper of status, but as someone who had mistaken visibility for value. The quiet hum of the restaurant returned slowly, conversations resuming, but softer now, more measured, as if the entire room had absorbed the lesson without needing it explained. Emily glanced briefly toward the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass, then back at the table, her focus returning to the present with effortless control. And without looking up, she spoke again, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Please continue as usual." And that was all. No correction, no demand, just a simple instruction that restored order more effectively than any apology could have, because it did not erase what had happened. It simply placed it where it belonged, in the past. leaving everyone else to carry its meaning forward. And as Daniel finally stepped back, the distance between who he thought he was and what he had just become settled quietly into place, not announced, not corrected, but understood by everyone who had witnessed it. Daniel did not return to his position immediately. Instead, he remained just beyond the edge of the dining floor, watching as the rhythm of the restaurant reformed around Emily Carter with an ease that made his earlier certainty feel almost naive. Because nothing about her presence disrupted the system, it revealed it. Every server who approached her table did so with quiet confidence, not hesitation, each movement precise, familiar, as if they had done this many times before. And that was when Daniel understood something he had missed entirely. This was not a rare visit. This was routine, the kind of presence that did not need announcement because it was already woven into the foundation of the place. He glanced toward the host's stand where the reservation system glowed softly on the screen, and for the first time in years, he questioned it, not the data itself, but his reliance on it. Because everything he trusted to define value had just failed him in the most public way possible. A junior host stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Should I adjust the seating log?" he asked quietly, uncertain, and Daniel hesitated, the answer no longer obvious, because adjusting a log would imply a mistake in the system, and deep down he now knew the system had been correct all along. It was his interpretation that had been flawed. "Leave it," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, and that single decision marked a shift, not in the room, but in him. Across the floor, Emily lifted her glass slightly as the server poured water, her movements composed, unhurried, as if nothing about the evening required correction, and yet everything had changed. The man in the tailored suit stood nearby, reviewing something on a tablet, occasionally glancing toward her for confirmation, each subtle exchange reinforcing the same truth. Her authority was not loud, not visible in the ways Daniel had been trained to recognize, but it was absolute. And that realization settled deeper with every passing second. A couple seated near the window leaned closer to one another, whispering, their earlier amusement replaced with something quieter, more reflective, and Daniel caught fragments of it. Not words exactly, but tone, the shift from judgment to reconsideration, and it mirrored his own, because the more he observed, the clearer it became that nothing about Emily's presence had changed, only his perception had, and that was the part he could not undo. He took a slow breath, straightening his jacket out of habit, but the gesture felt different now, less like a display of control and more like an attempt to regain composure, not for the room, but for himself. And in that moment, he saw the space as it truly was, not a stage where he decided who belonged, but a system built on values he had quietly replaced with assumptions. The polished floors, the soft lighting, the carefully curated atmosphere. None of it was designed to exclude, it was meant to reflect a standard, and that standard had never been about appearance. It had been about awareness, something he had just failed to demonstrate. Across the room, Emily's gaze lifted briefly, not searching, not questioning, but simply present, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met again. And this time, there was no tension, no confrontation, just clarity, the kind that does not need words to be understood. And Daniel realized then that the most defining moment of the night had already passed. Not when she walked in, not when she was turned away, but in the quiet seconds after, when everything that followed revealed exactly what he had chosen to overlook. And as the restaurant continued its steady rhythm, unchanged on the surface, the truth beneath it remained unmistakable and permanent, because some lessons do not arrive with noise, they settle in silence. And once they do not leave. The evening continued as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but beneath the polished surface of Lauron dining, every detail now carried a different weight, every glance more measured, every movement more deliberate, and Daniel could feel it in the way the staff adjusted without being told, in the way conversations softened when Emily Carter's name was mentioned in passing, because it was no longer just a name, it was context, it was understanding, it was the missing piece that had reframed the entire night. He moved slowly along the edge of the dining room, no longer directing, no longer correcting, but observing, seeing the space with a clarity that had not existed for him before. The systems he trusted were still there, the reservation lists, the dress codes, the the unspoken rules, but now he saw how easily they could become filters instead of guides, how quickly they could distort judgment when applied without awareness. Across the room, Emily listened quietly as the man in the tailored suit spoke about projections and timelines. Her responses brief, precise, never raised, yet each word seemed to settle decisions instantly, as if no further confirmation was needed. And that was the difference Daniel could not ignore, authority that did not demand attention, but naturally held it. A server approached her table with a new dish, describing it with careful detail, but not with the exaggerated tone used for guests meant to be impressed. Instead, it was calm, respectful, as if speaking to someone who already understood, and Emily nodded once, acknowledging, nothing more, no performance, no display, just presence, and that presence had reshaped the entire room. Daniel paused near the bar, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind the bottles, and for a moment, he studied it, not his appearance, but what it represented, the role he had carried so confidently, the authority he believed he held, and how easily it had been challenged, not by force, not by confrontation, but by a simple truth revealed at the right moment, a truth he had overlooked because it did not match what he expected to see. A quiet conversation reached his ears from nearby guests, their voices low but clear enough to catch fragments. "I thought she was just," one began, then stopped, as if realizing how incomplete that assumption had been, and that unfinished sentence lingered, because it reflected exactly what Daniel had done. He had filled in the blanks with certainty instead of curiosity, and now those blanks had been replaced with something far more precise, reality. He straightened slightly, not out of habit this time, but out of awareness, understanding that what had changed tonight was not the restaurant, not the guests, not even Emily. It was him, the way he saw, the way he decided, the way he defined who belonged. And as he looked once more toward the window table, where Emily sat in quiet command of a space she never needed to claim, he understood that the most powerful shift had not been her reveal, it had been his realization, and in that realization was something far more lasting than embarrassment. It was correction, the kind that does not announce itself, does not demand attention, but stays, reshaping every decision that follows. Because once you see clearly, you cannot return to assumptions, and that night, Daniel Brooks saw everything differently. By the time the evening began to wind down, nothing outwardly dramatic had happened, no raised voices, no public apology, no scene that would be remembered for spectacle, and yet something far more lasting had taken place, something that settled into the quiet corners of Laurent dining and stayed there long after the last glass was cleared. Emily Carter finished her meal with the same calm composure she had carried from the moment she walked in, her presence steady, unchanging, as if the events of the night had simply confirmed what she already understood about the world around her. The man in the tailored suit stood beside her one final time, exchanging a few quiet words about upcoming decisions, timelines, responsibilities that extended far beyond the walls of the restaurant. And then, just as seamlessly as she had arrived, Emily rose from her chair, her hand resting briefly on the table before she stepped away, and the room responded without being told, chairs shifting subtly, staff aligning instinctively, the quiet choreography of respect moving with her as she crossed the floor. Daniel stood near the entrance, no longer as a gatekeeper, but as a witness, watching her approach not with the confidence he once carried, but with a clarity that had replaced it. And as she drew closer, he straightened, not out of habit, but out of understanding. Because this moment, simple as it appeared, held more weight than any formal correction could have delivered. Emily paused just briefly as she passed him, her gaze meeting his for a fraction of a second. And in that glance there was no anger, no resentment, just recognition, the kind that acknowledges what has already been revealed without needing to repeat it. And then she continued, the glass doors opening once more, the night air slipping in as she stepped out into the city lights. And just like that, she was gone, leaving behind not silence, but something deeper, a shift that could not be undone. Daniel remained where he was, the reflection of the dining room stretching behind him, and for the first time in 5 years, he did not rush to reset the space, did not move to restore what he thought had been disrupted, because he now understood that nothing had been disrupted at all. It had been clarified. The values he believed he upheld had been present all along. He had simply failed to see them, and that realization settled into him with a quiet permanence, one that would follow him long after the night ended. Because respect was never something he controlled, it was something he recognized or failed to, and the difference between those two was everything. As the final guests began to leave and the lights softened, Laurent dining returned to its usual rhythm, unchanged to anyone passing by. But to those who had been there, to those who had seen, there was a new awareness woven into the space, subtle, unspoken, but unmistakable. And for Daniel Brooks, that awareness became the only standard that mattered. Because once you understand what dignity truly looks like, you never mistake it again.